We're really pleased to have Leanne Dowse from the University of New South Wales to speak about understanding the complex trajectories of people with intellectual disability in the criminal justice system. It's fascinating research, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the paper. Thank you.
Juggle that there. Thank you very much. Thanks very much to Mark and to Endeavour for inviting me to come and present our research today. Before I start, I'd like to join with others in acknowledging the lands on which we meet today and to pay my respects to the Aboriginal elders past and present. It's been a really lovely start to the day for me to be in a room of like-minded people, and so many of the issues that have been raised today are things that we've been trying to grapple with in our research since we've been going for around about 10 years. So I hope that what I'm going to be able to present to you today addresses some of the concerns that people have raised this morning about the lack of evidence. So what I'm going to do, unfortunately for you perhaps, is to show you a lot of evidence. So a lot of my paper has lots of graphs and lots of data, but please don't feel obliged to scribble it all down. We have a background paper that kind of pulls together a lot of what I'm going to present to you today, and don't feel as though you need to understand all the graphs. I'm really showing them to you as an illustrative point, and I'm very happy to make my PowerPoint presentation available. What I'm going to try and talk to you about is, first of all, the context of the problem. Many people already have talked about the overall context. But I'm going to try and talk to you a little bit about the sort of more theoretical stuff that we've been trying to develop as a result of the data that we have and the information that we've been able to pull together over the last 10 years. And to try and reframe a little bit the attention to intellectual disability in the criminal justice system, and to broaden that out a little bit. And I'm going to use my data to show you why I think that's necessary. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study, which is called the MHDCD study, which stands for Mental Health and Cognitive Disability in the Criminal Justice Project. Then I'm going to run you through some selected key findings. One of the things that we've been doing over the last 10 years is pulling together a really comprehensive data set, and on that data set we've done a whole range of different research. So I'm going to pull together a few different projects that I've been working on for the last mainly 5 years, which pulls together other funded research, some work that doctoral students have been doing on the data set. So it's a very broad-based sort of conceptualisation of what we think is going on. In particular, I'm also going to utilise some work that we've been doing around costing, because I know that people have already mentioned this issue of major costs, and I'm going to show you some costings, hopefully, that will chime with your own experience. Often when I do this sort of presentation, people in the room nod all the time, because all of you, I'm sure, will know, and the picture I'm going to present rings true with your experience. But what we don't have currently is an integrated way of sort of talking about those issues. And so that's what I hope my paper will do today. And hopefully I'll finish with some discussions and conclusions about how we address this issue, which we're really identifying as complex needs or complex support needs in the criminal justice system. So the context of the problem, we know that there's Eileen and I started in 2004, I think it was, with this conversation about this social exclusion and criminalisation of a particular group of people with disabilities. We know that this group, from anecdotal evidence as well as some of the studies that have been done, are very overrepresented in both police work, in the work of courts and justice, in the prisons, and we know that they're overrepresented both as offenders and as victims. We know that their needs are very complex. So the simple idea that someone has an intellectual disability and then comes into contact with the criminal justice system, I'm going to try and trouble that notion a little bit and broaden the picture out to some degree. We know for many of the people that we're going to look at in our research, their trajectories into the criminal justice system start very early in their lives, and I know many of you will understand that situation. We also know that responsive welfare provision and early intervention can be effective. We've seen some evidence of that in other studies, in addressing this kind of social exclusion that happens very early, and also this kind of increasing vulnerability. But we also know that the particular experience of people who have disabilities and who are at risk of engagement in the criminal justice system is pretty poorly understood. So we know that in Australia and in comparable jurisdictions, we know that our systematic responses and our current welfare responses only have a very limited impact on preventing this early contact and also stopping that from escalating into a lifelong cycle of incarceration and reincarceration. And we know that we need a multi-systemic pathway understanding and advocacy around that. So in thinking about the sort of study we wanted to do to try and address some of these issues, we put together a couple of ARC linkage projects. The first one was funded in 2007, which looked at, and there's a whole range of people, I won't necessarily tell you all of those, but it was a linkage project that brought together key researchers and government agencies in New South Wales, partner organisations for corrective services, justice health, police, housing, and the New South Wales Council on Intellectual Disability. Many of you will know the fantastic work that they've been doing over some time, identified with the work of Jim Simpson. We've also then subsequently had lots of other research funding to look at specific issues within the data set. So we have a project website which is there, and you can go to there and you can see the sorts of different studies. There's a whole range of nested studies there as well. But just to give you a quick sense of the actual approach that we've used, we started out thinking what we really need to do is get this longitudinal picture. And so short of sort of doing a longitudinal study, we decided that one of the things that would be helpful is to get a sense of what happens to people over time through their interactions with agencies, with services. So we started out by identifying a cohort of people, a group of people who we know had been in the criminal justice system and whose diagnoses we would have access to. So we sourced a cohort of people from the New South Wales Inmate Health Survey from 2001, and also from New South Wales Corrective Services statewide disability data set. So we started out with 2,731 people who are important to say are not a representative sample of people in the criminal justice system who have disabilities, but this is a purposive sample. We wanted to go and find a group of people who we knew were at risk, and we wanted to be able to look at those people specifically. So the findings I'm going to show you are not representative, but what I'm going to do is describe the cohort. What we then did is we took those individuals' identifiers and we went to all of these government agencies. We got information about their health contacts in hospitals, their adult custody episodes and any notes that happen while they're in the corrective system, their court information around their reoffending from Bureau of Crime Statistics, from New South Wales Police. So there we have all events that the person's been a part of, all of the charges and all of the custody. And importantly there, we have all of the police narratives. So every time one of these individuals has come into contact with the police officer and the police officer's written something in the system, we have access to all of that. And that in itself is an incredible and sobering picture. We have all of the information on client and custody contacts from juvenile justice. We have housing records, anyone who's had a tenancy or an application to housing. We have disability service records. We have legal aid records, so any advice or application to legal aid. And we have mortality data, pharmacotherapy data, and hospital admissions through health. And we also have information about people's out-of-home care experience. The other thing that we've been doing over the last few years is also conducting a more qualitative-based study around Indigenous people in particular. So we've had Indigenous researchers in 7 different sites in New South Wales and in Alice Springs, talking to communities, people who themselves have been affected, service providers, etc. So I might not get on to giving you much detail about that study, but certainly in the first round of work that we did, it was really obvious that Indigenous Australians are particularly vulnerable and particularly disadvantaged in this area. So effectively our data set is a SQL relational data set. So individuals are identified, the data set itself is de-identified, so all of the information I'm telling you today is around de-identified data. But we've linked all of those different bits of information from every different system together, and we're able to create pathway analysis. So, just to give you a sense of what we have and to kind of give you a sense of what the graphs are going to look like, there's 2,731 people in the cohort. And we've been able to identify across different sources the different diagnostic labels that these people have been given. And I'm not arguing that diagnostics are the be-all and end-all, but this is just one way that the system itself identifies people. And what we've been able to do is identify that hardly anybody has just one diagnosis. What you'll see from this graph is that we've been able to identify people across their multiple diagnostic groups. So we've been able to identify, as of the 2,731 people, there are 351 who have a borderline intellectual disability diagnosis, a mental health diagnosis, and an alcohol and other drug diagnosis. We've got an ID, intellectual disability, mental health and AID. We've got all of these groups, so borderline intellectual disability and drug and alcohol, intellectual disability, drug and alcohol, intellectual disability and mental health and alcohol and other drug. And then we have the single diagnosis groups as well. And we also have a small group of people who have not had a diagnosis. That's not to say they don't have issues, because they are in prison, but we have no evidence. So it's not a control group as such, but it's a very interesting comparator. So one of the things I just want you to note here is that the way the graphs are structured is that on your left-hand side, we start with the complex diagnosis. So we're talking about these groups as people with complex support needs or complex diagnoses. And that becomes very important when we look at the sorts of things that I'm going to present in terms of the findings. So what we know is that there are 680 people with an intellectual disability. There are 783 people with a borderline intellectual disability, 1,642 with a mental health disorder diagnosis, 1,985 who have a substance use disorder, 174 with no diagnosis, as I said. We also found 511 people who had acquired brain injury diagnosis. 11% of the group are women, 25% of the group are Indigenous, and of that whole group, 69%, almost 70%, have more than one diagnosis, have this kind of complex look. What you can see, of course, here with these numbers, that they're not mutually exclusive. It's just giving you a sense of the different sorts of diagnoses. In terms of the language that I'm going to use the term cognitive disability today rather than intellectual disability. And that is it's being used much more widely now in New South Wales, particularly in corrections. Which encompasses borderline intellectual disability and intellectual disability, but it might also encompass people with acquired brain injury. And there are a whole range of diagnostic issues which we may not have time to go into today about how people are identified and what sorts of labels they get. But 1,463 people have a cognitive disability diagnosis of some kind. Hello. 680 have a score in the ID range. Of those, 576 have multiple diagnoses. So I'm trying to build up this picture of complexity. Don't worry too much about the numbers, but only 15% of them have no other diagnosis other than their intellectual cognitive impairment diagnosis. 783 or 50% have borderline. Of those, 88% have multiple diagnoses. So already we're building up this picture of people with very complex diagnostic criteria. Only 12% of people who have borderline intellectual disability don't have something else. And 86% of those with a cognitive disability of any kind also have other diagnoses. So what we're immediately seeing is this very much more complex picture of intellectual disability than much of the discourse and the research that we've seen so far. So I'm going to kind of explain to you, in a sense, what we think about as complex support needs. So the complex needs literature is relatively small, and it's emerged from particularly the UK. We've been using words like dual diagnosis and comorbidity, but we're trying to kind of broaden this issue to beyond diagnosis, to the kind of social vulnerability. So complex support needs is really talking about a label of some kind that's associated with vulnerability and social marginalisation. What we see in this group is multiple interlocking experiences and factors that span health, mental health and social issues. These include, and I've got the list there, mental health, cognitive disability, physical disability, behavioural difficulties, precarious housing, social isolation, family dysfunction, problematic drug and alcohol use, risk of harm in early life, early educational disengagement and contact with the criminal justice system. So I'm sure that for many of you, you will think, yeah, that's the group of people we're talking about. So we're really trying to work a bit more with this kind of understanding. So let me start now with the graph, so brace yourselves. And what I'm going to try and do is present something of a life course kind of history. So I'm going to talk about early life and education and then move into different contexts with different systems. And I'm going to be able to use some case studies to demonstrate some of the things. So this is first slide is about education. So again, don't worry too much about the detail, but basically what the detail here is showing you is that the green, sorry, let me just find my pointer. So the pink, for instance, is primary school only, people who identify as having primary school only. So there's also this purple, which is never attended school. So you start to see that those with more red and blue are those that have higher qualification, higher school experience. So what this basically is showing you is that although we know the prison population itself has very low levels of education, people with these kind of diagnoses have even lower levels of educational attainment. So those who have some form of cognitive disability, so of those groups here that have a BID or an ID, we see those who have that in combination, so again, all those on your left, have extremely poor high school attainment, with the majority by far of having only had either primary school or leaving school without any qualification. So we already know that we're failing this group at the very earliest point in a kind of systemic contact. The other thing that we've looked at is school expulsion. So those in the mental health in our cohort, we compared with a group of prisoners who'd been in prison and had similar trajectories but did not have a disability diagnosis. And it's obvious that more people who have, in our cohort, have been expelled. So they've been suspended and expelled from school very consistently over their lives. So there's actually something going on with the way the education system in the first place deals with people. So we've got high levels of males versus females who are... So the school system, when you start to muck up, you start to get successively removed from the school environment. Now, I mean, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that doesn't really seem particularly sensible when that's probably the one place that it's possible to intervene in this kind of early intervention framework. So just to give you a broader sense of what the education data is showing us, that again, the diagnosed groups have lower levels of education than the general prisoner population, that those who have cognitive disability fare much worse. Of those who have complex diagnoses, over 80% had no formal qualification, with most of them leaving school before year 10. When we look between the two groups of people who have a disability and don't, we see most of them leaving school without a qualification, being expelled, or some attending special school, but only quite a small proportion attending a special school, which is an issue of concern. And it raises the issue of identification, and that people who get a label early tend to be those who are not socially disadvantaged, who have families and others advocating on their behalf for a place in the system. And I think what we're seeing for this group is that even very early on, the system is letting us down in terms of identification of that group. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the out-of-home care experience of the group. So when we look at the people in our cohort and compare it to the inmate health survey people we find that more people in our cohort have been in the out-of-home care system, and that particularly women who have mental health disorders and cognitive disabilities are very much highly overrepresented in the out-of-home care group. So you can see there a spread across the different diagnostic groups of those who've been in out-of-home care. So you can see, of course, that the very highest groups, again, are those with complex diagnoses. But when I just tell you that out of that group, 4 out of the highest proportions of people who've been in out-of-home care are in the groups where cognitive impairment is present. So starting to see a picture of young people with cognitive impairment are moving into out-of-home care much more regularly than those who don't. There's also a very high association with alcohol and other drug use disorder and out-of-home care. Whether that's what the relationship there, we can't really tell, but there's certainly a co-occurrence of those things. So we know that 1% of the general population moves into out-of-home care. In our cohort, I think we've got something like 15% or so moving into out-of-home care, so very concerning. When we look at the actual nature of the out-of-home care placements, we can see here, so the blue lines, those average number of placements over the time that we have data available. And the red line is the number of days in placement. So you can see that those who have high numbers of placement include those with mental health disorder. But when you look at the rest, again, they are those in the complex groups. So the people with intellectual disability and borderline intellectual disability complex groups make up 4 out of the 5 top groups here. Those with intellectual disability or in combination with alcohol and other drug make up the top 5 groups of people. And they also, if you look at the red line, also have by far the shortest durations. So they're moving in and out of different placements and they're only staying for very short periods of time. So people are there in a placement for up to 2 weeks. So it's telling us something about this instability that's starting very early in life. School disengagement, moving frequently in and out of home care for short periods. And that's a pattern that we'll see across the whole life course into the criminal justice system as well. When you look at out-of-home care in relationship to juvenile justice involvement, you see that the higher proportion, so the line on your left is those who have no out-of-home care experience, and those who have, on the right-hand side, have been in out-of-home care. So those who are the red have also been in juvenile justice. So again, we're seeing that those who've got complex diagnoses turn up much more, and who've been in out-of-home care are much more likely to move into the juvenile justice system. So 77% of people who've been in out-of-home care in our cohort have also been in juvenile justice. The other thing to note is that they're not just in juvenile justice once or twice, they're highly frequently in juvenile justice. So those who've been in out-of-home care have been in the juvenile justice system on average 9 times, and those who've not been in out-of-home care have been in the juvenile justice system on average about 4 times. So again, startling evidence of disadvantage. When you look at gender here, females in our cohort, women in our cohort who've been in out-of-home care are much more likely to end up in juvenile justice than males in the cohort. So there's something gendered going on here, which is really important to take note of. So we do think about this group largely as boys and men. And in fact, there are small numbers of women, but those women who are in our cohort and in the system are extremely disadvantaged. And as I'll show you later, if you're also Indigenous and female, you are the most disadvantaged of all. So in terms of Indigenous, again, we can see Indigenous Australians are more likely to have been in out-of-home care than those who are non-Indigenous in our group. Okay, those who've been in out-of-home care also have a substantial difference in terms of their contact with police. So there's this graph is showing you the average number of times that the individuals in the group have been in contact with police. So for those who have been in out-of-home care, I pushed the wrong button. You can see that they have, on average, just under 90 instances of being a person of interest in contact with the police, whereas those who've not been in out-of-home care have, on average, around about 40, 48, something like that. So again, we're seeing this complex presentation, this complex picture. In terms of adult custody, we see the same thing. So there's an overrepresentation of those who've got out-of-home care history and in the juvenile justice system, and this carries through into the adult correction system. So those who've been in out-of-home care and have a mental health or cognitive disability have an average of 7.5 custody episodes. And remember, our data isn't completely lifelong, so our data set comes up until about 2009. We're hoping to update that soon, but even here we can see that people who've been in out-of-home care and who have disabilities have more adult custody than those who don't. So what I wanted to do was just to give you a sort of a summary sense of the things that are going on in terms of family context then. So 23% of the cohort have been in out-of-home care, compared with 19% of those who don't have a disability who've been in prison, and also compared to 1% of the general population. So we're talking about significant overrepresentation here. Of those who have been in out-of-home care, 60% have complex diagnoses, and of those, 80% have cognitive impairment present. When we look at what's happened in early life, for most of them there's been no difference in whether they've been with their families between the ages of 0 and 10. But when you look at the data from when people turn 11 or 12 and into their into their late teenage years, people with mental health disorders and cognitive disabilities are much more likely to move into out-of-home care in that stage of their lives. So early intervention is one thing, but what does early intervention mean, and at what points might we want to intervene here is important. We also see obvious intergenerational disadvantage. So for those in the cohort, there's a larger percentage of those, that's 18% of them, have also had a parent who have been incarcerated. And also, they also have high proportions of parents who've also themselves been in out-of-home care. So we're looking at that complex intergenerational disadvantage. So, in summary, those who've been in out-of-home care, 84% of them have complex needs, 90% of them have cognitive impairment, they have younger age at first police contact, they have twice as many police contacts over their lives, they have twice as many custodial episodes over their lives, they're 3 times as likely to have been in juvenile justice, and Aboriginal Australians are much more likely to have been in out-of-home care. So we're not even really talking about criminal justice yet, we're just talking about early life disadvantage here, and I'm sure that chimes with many people's perception. So what I'm going to do now is talk to you about, so one of the things that we can do with our data set is we can select an individual and pull every bit of data about that individual and then create a case study or a life sort of history. So I'm going to tell you about Eddie. He's an Indigenous man. He's now in his late 30s. He's been variously diagnosed over his lifetime with intellectual disability, borderline personality disorder, which many people have been diagnosed as the kind of grab bag of diagnosis when you don't really know what to diagnose somebody with. He also has alcohol and other drug substance use disorder. He's identified as having polydrug use from when he was 6 years old, and so he's gone through alcohol, cannabis, prescription drugs, amphetamines, heroin, methadone, and etc. He's been the victim of abuse from a very young age. He was first placed in out-of-home care at 9 for 2 weeks, and for the next 6 years he sort of cycled in and out of different out-of-home care, 9 different foster homes, which lasted between 5 days and 2 weeks, and his placements broke down because of his behaviour effectively. He had his first police contact at age 11 and his first custodial episode at age 13. He was constantly suspended and expelled from school from the age of about 13. He doesn't seem to have attended school at all after that time. And when he was at school, he was known as the drug dealer. From about 14, he moves between foster care, a youth refuge, and I think that's one of the things that we're also needing to really pay attention to is the kind of unstable, hostel, yet refuge, kind of boarding house picture for this group of people. I know Kathy's shaking, nodding in agreement there. So all of his placements in any of these places break down because of his aggressive behaviour and his assaults on others. He tells police at one point that he's having problems coping with life generally and that he's not able to get on with anyone and everyone's against him. What you also see in this group and other research, particularly Ruth McFarlane in New South Wales has done work looking at how in out-of-home care placements particularly, staff tend to resort to the use of police in managing problem behaviour. And so what's happening for this group is that they are actually being constantly reconnected to the criminal justice system because of their out-of-home care placement. As a young person, he's regularly in prison for breaching his bail conditions, and often they say things like he can't go out unless he's accompanied by a responsible adult. But what we already know is that this man doesn't have a responsible adult actually in his life. So he's set up to be breaching his bail conditions from the minute they're given. He's also noted to be a regular self-harmer and is admitted to hospital for multiple suicide attempts and drug overdoses. As an adult, he's also regularly scheduled under the Mental Health Act, very common progression for this group of people, and he's hospitalised for suicide and self-harm. He has multiple custody episodes in adult prison for theft, and when he's not in custody, the police note that he's often has no fixed place of abode, so he's homeless. I'm sure that this picture is not something that's new to anybody. But what probably is new to some of you is that what we've managed to do in part of another arm of our research, and that's the reference there and the website, we've managed to go to agencies and try and get some sense of what each of these things cost. So for every episode that he's had, we've been able to apply a cost and count it up. So this is very much an underestimation of what's happened in this guy's life. But what we can see is that up until he's in his 30s, he's cost the system almost $2 million, $1,945,066. So from a young age, he's the person who's uncontrollable, he's attention-seeking. These are all the sorts of things that are in the police narratives particularly. Instead of being seen as someone who's in need of care and protection, before he turns 18, he's already cost $1.2 million in his out-of-home care and other institutional costs. So despite his extensive diagnoses, he really doesn't get very much effective intervention, is what's pretty obvious here, either as a young person or as an adult. So cumulatively, his $2 million by the age of, I think he's 23 when we did this, are basically about his institutionalisation costs. If we took that $2 million and spent it in other ways earlier in different kind of contexts, I think you could all identify that there's probably likely to be a saving there. Okay, I'm just going to talk briefly about disability services. Of those who have diagnoses in our group, very, very few have had disability service intervention. Only 23% of people with an intellectual disability, that is those who will fit the criteria for a service under New South Wales ADAC, but I'm not sure what the situation is in Queensland, but I suspect it's the same, IQ of 70 or less. So only 23% of people who would be eligible for a service have received one, and those with a borderline intellectual disability, an IQ in that range, only 4% have received a disability service. So what we see is that there's a very high rate of people with intellectual disability or cognitive impairment who are not receiving services from the disability provider. And also what's interesting about this group is for a very high number of them, that's 79% of this group, their intellectual disability or cognitive impairment was not identified until they got to adult prison. So it's, horses bolted in a sense. It's a very, very frightening number of people who, and again, we are speculating that those people are not identified largely because of their social disadvantage or because they're seen as offenders from a very young age or problem children or whatever, or from their complex social circumstances that sort of obscures the fact that disability is there. The other thing to note also is that most of these people have IQs in the very mild to borderline range. So they're not people who are living in group homes or need 24-hour support. And in fact, if you think about that, in fact, they have the highest support needs of all people because they're not identified, they don't have supports they don't have an entree into any particular systems. Yet we see them in systems everywhere. We see them in the out-of-home care system. We see them in the juvenile justice system. So not falling through the cracks, they're actually everywhere. Talk to you a little bit about homelessness. So homelessness is very difficult to track, of course, because there's no one marker for homelessness. But in our cohort, we've tried to find a range of different ways of identifying when somebody's been in no fixed place of abode. So here again, those blue lines are people here in the cohort who have been identified as being homeless, and red not. And again, you can see the same pattern. All those on your left have higher rates of homelessness than those on the right with a single diagnosis or no diagnosis. Pretty consistent picture across that the more complex you are, the more likely you are to be homeless. For Indigenous people who are, my title's not coming up, there it is, the picture's even worse. So Indigenous people are much more highly represented in the homeless group, with 28% of people experiencing homelessness being Indigenous. They're even overrepresented within our sample. And again, Indigenous women with complex diagnoses are much more likely to be homeless than anyone else. When you think about homelessness and complex needs, these complex groups, what we're showing here is that the people who are blue are much more likely to be of no fixed place of abode here than those who do not have complex needs. So building up that same picture. I don't know where to point this to make it work. Okay, so just a thing to try and bring this together. So we're looking here at homelessness, the presence of complex needs. We're looking at police contact, conviction and custody here. So it's a lot going on, but effectively those on your left are those who have complex needs and those on your right do not. Those on the left-hand side are again likely to have, so the blue line is average police contact. So those who have complex needs and are homeless have far and away the highest number of police contacts. But you can see that same pattern happening from complex to non-complex. They also have a higher number of average police contacts and a higher number of convictions. So it's a bit stark in terms of how these social factors move into how we see somebody feature within the criminal justice system itself. So just to summarise this housing and instability, so we see that significant numbers of people with complex needs experience homeless or unstable housing, and that's both as young people and as adults. That the significant numbers of them had parents in public housing. Significant numbers move in and out of refuges and other crisis accommodation as young people. People with complex needs had higher rates of terminations and evictions of their tenancies than others. 42% of those evictions are due to incarceration or reincarceration. Indigenous persons are overrepresented amongst those who are homeless. Indigenous women with complex needs have the highest proportion of homelessness. And those with complex needs and are experiencing homelessness have higher rates of police contact, higher rates of custody episodes, and lower average days in custody. Okay. Everyone okay? Sorry, I know there's a lot here, but it is really nice to be able to show some evidence for what all of you already know. Now I'm just going to talk more generally, focusing on the criminal justice contact of the group. So here we're looking at police contact, conviction and custody. So the blue line is the average age at the first contact with police. So the shorter the line, the younger you are. The red line is the age at first conviction, and the green line is the age at which you experience your first custodial episode as an adult. The juvenile justice figures are not in here. But again, the same picture you can see. Consistently, those within the complex groups have lower age of first contact, higher and higher contact with police. So those who have cognitive disability as part of their complex diagnosis have the lowest age of everything. And those who are juvenile justice clients are also much more disadvantaged. They are in the system from a much earlier age. This is the same picture but for the Indigenous people in the cohort, and it's very much the same picture except the ages are lower. So Indigenous Australians are again more disadvantaged than their non-Indigenous peers. Here's an example, another case example of a young man called Matthew. He's an Indigenous young man. He's now around 23 or 24 and he's currently in prison. At the time that our data was collected, he was serving a custodial sentence. He's been diagnosed with borderline intellectual disability, mental health, multiple mental health diagnoses and substance use disorder. He's been known to police. He's from a rural town in New South Wales. He's been known to police since he was 7. And he was first identified as a child at risk because he was wandering the streets of his town while his parents were intoxicated or unavailable to look after him. By the time he was 10, he'd been picked up or had contact with the police on 20 occasions, generally because he was wandering the streets homeless or because he was stealing money to buy food. Both of his parents are from highly disadvantaged backgrounds, and they were known to police as living in a context with very high drug and alcohol use from when he was born. He's lived between the streets and various relatives from early life. He moves into out-of-home care when he's 10, but placements break down because of his unruly behaviour. He has poor school attendance, and although we have records that he was expelled in year 8, it looks like he stopped going to school round about year 4. He didn't get beyond year 4. He's known to have been sexually assaulted by a neighbour in police records from when he was 11. He moves into juvenile justice at the age of 10 and then goes in and out of juvenile custody 10 times before he's 18 for increasingly serious issues. So he starts out as low-level petty theft and he moves to armed robbery and sexual assault. By the time of 18, he's known for his sadistic assaults and sexual assaults and his threatening behaviour, particularly on women. And he's also known to be carrying a weapon. So by the time he's 18, the police have had contact with him over 300 times. He's had multiple remand and custody, and he's had also in his records multiple self-harms in custody, and he's been given pharmaceutical drugs whilst in custody. Here's his total. He's the $2.8 million man. So he's a very costly example of cycling in and out of homelessness, the criminal justice system, and we've only costed this till he's 21. He's been living on and off the streets, as you know, but most of his contacts, I mean, $1 million worth of that is contact with police because he's literally on the streets. He's vulnerable to contact with police because he's there. You can see his risk factors from a very, very early age. He's identified as a child at risk in the police narratives early on, but by the time he's about 12, he is the risk. He's moved from at risk to become the risky boy. So from age 15, he's really decidedly a risk, and he's dealt with more in the surveillance and punitive system than in any form of social support from that stage. There's obviously lots and lots of indications that this boy has come to the attention of every service in his small town from when he's an infant almost. And whilst all of that is known, we still see his trajectory escalating and costing the system and himself huge amounts. Okay, a little bit of a sense of what's happening in the legal aid space. Legal aid is one of the agencies that almost every person in the cohort has contact with, interestingly. Of course, there are complexities around that because legal aid is almost a voluntary service. So there's, whilst it might be great to think, oh, maybe we can get legal aid to do something with this group, legal aid, it's a voluntary relationship, and so there are some complexities there. So about 95% of people have applied for legal aid assistance. Again, you can see the same picture. Those with complex diagnoses have ever had a criminal case is the blue line, ever had a family case, and ever had a civil case. So it's not just criminal justice matters that are important for this group, but also civil and family matters as well, but very high users of the legal aid system. Just wanted to mention very briefly the use of diversion. So in New South Wales, we have a statute of the part of the Mental Health Act, Criminal Procedures Act, which is called Section 32. It's a diversionary mechanism, so you can be identified as having being able to have your needs met outside the justice system, and Section 32 effectively is where you would get a treatment plan or a program plan, normally with the disability service. We already know that disability service usage is extremely low for this group, but also the use of Section 32 is extremely low. So there have been 618 total uses of Section 32 for all of the, I can't remember how many contacts there are, but thousands and thousands and thousands. So Section 32 is not working for this group. They are not being identified. Anecdotally, people say that often the legal there's not capacity within legal systems to spend the time to get an assessment, to get a treatment order, etc. There's also a very major issue in terms of something that Patrick was talking about this morning around if you get a Section 32, you can end up underneath an order with the disability service sector, which is, as we've already seen, relatively punitive for many people. You can end up on that order for quite some time, and if you just actually gone to court, pleaded and served, you'd be out. So there's a lot of problematic issues around Section 32 which are currently being looked at by the New South Wales Law Reform Commission, but I think the issue around diversion for this group is a very complex one. Okay, court matters. This shows exactly the same pattern that we've seen before. No new news here. So here, the average of numbers of finalised matters is the blue line. So again, you can see those with the complex diagnoses have higher court matters, finalised court matters, and also higher rates over the course of a year for that. So they're in the courts a lot. A little bit about bail and remand. A much higher proportion who received bail in this receiving bail were held on remand. 30% had had bail refused. And the complex groups, again, as you can see, so what this graph is showing is the average number of days, length of stay on remand. So these people are staying on remand for shorter periods of time, but the red line is the average number. So they are people, I think Kathy also said it this morning, moving in and out of remand often and for short periods, meaning that they're very unlikely to receive any form of intervention whilst they're on remand. Juvenile justice, I've touched on it before, but just to show you again, 914 people within our group had contact with juvenile justice. 80% of those had been in custody in a juvenile detention centre. As again, same picture, those who are more complex. So this is blue is ever having been a client of juvenile justice, and red is ever having been in custody, but exactly the same picture. Those with multiple diagnoses, particularly of which cognitive impairment is a part, are much more likely to have been in juvenile justice. Okay, one more case study. Natalie's a young woman with an intellectual disability. She's got a history of substance use disorder, and she's had just about every mental health diagnosis under the sun. So she's had dissocial personality disorder, attention deficit disorder, emotionally unstable personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, psychotic disorder due to the harmful use of cannabinoids. She's attended a special school but left school with no qualifications of any kind. She was banned from school when she was about 12, I think, for abusing the school staff. She wasn't able to stay in her family home because she has a brother who has an active mental illness, and there was a whole lot of aggravation going on. Police are also called to an incident where she's sexually assaulted by her sibling. She's had multiple contacts with police as a young person, mostly as a victim first, and then later a victim particularly of domestic violence and assault. But what we see for this woman is that those patterns of early life become repeated in her adult life when she moves into relationships that are also domestically violent. She also has AVOs taken out against her by all sorts of people. Her first custody in juvenile justice is when she's 15, and then the year later after the first one she has seven episodes of custody over 4 months. She has also multiple alerts for self-harm. She's often noted as having no fixed place of abode. She spends time in out-of-home care, then she moves into refuges, but generally speaking, those placements break down because she's just too hard. She also lives in a place where she's known to everybody, and so when police pick her up and say, where can we take her, they do the ring around at the refuges and they all say, she's not coming here. So you can see this active pushing people away by services. She's had multiple hospital admissions for self-harm and suicide, and this is again a very common pattern. She moves into the systems that can't turn her away. So she's turning up to or being taken by police to hospitals and being admitted under the Mental Health Act. She's had guardianship and residential disability services, but during that time she has multiple contacts with police because she's maliciously damaging property and assaulting carers who are calling the police. She's had 3 high-risk pregnancies. She's all children born before she's 21. She's been the victim of domestic violence multiple times in her adult life within her relationships, and she's also the perpetrator of violence against her various partners. Often when the police arrive and say, "What can we do? We'll take out an AVO against that guy and get him into court." She says often her partners are also her carers and are drawing a carer pension, and she says, "No, I don't want anything to happen because I don't know what I'll do at home without him." She's frequently homeless and in custody as a young adult. Here's her spend. She's in most of her records, intellectual disability is almost never mentioned other than in one place that we could find it in her records. So her interactions with police, although have happened over quite a short time, are already $500,000, but she doesn't obviously get any form of effective intervention. Really startling for her is the violence that she's experiencing by multiple people in multiple sites within the system, in her residential and within her relationships and within her family. Her whole life is just completely, obviously sort of shaped by the violence that she's experiencing. None of her children stay with her, so we're seeing this, intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. And it's interesting that even though her healthcare costs very much around the emergency system, even though she's got multiple diagnoses, there's no systemic attempt or obvious evidence of her mental health issues being treated in any sustained way. Stick with me, people, I'm almost there. This one is around first contact with police, juvenile justice contact and police. And again, it's the same story that we're seeing. These complex groups have earlier age at first police contact, have frequent contacts before they move into custody. So there's evidence that police are trying to do something with this group, but actually in the end have no choice but to take people into custody because they're being turned away from hospitals and refuges particularly. I'm going to skip over that one, and I'm just going to do one final case study. This is Casey. She's an Indigenous young woman. She's got an intellectual disability and she's got multiple mental health diagnoses. She's known to police very early as a child at risk. Her school education's very tenuous and she doesn't attend school after about 13. From 12, she becomes in contact with police very frequently, 87 events over 10 months, which are almost all related to her calling 000. She refuses, and also her other offences are refusing to leave premises. So she climbs on the top of the roof of the hospital, the roof of the school and the roof of the doc's office, and no one can get her down, so they call the police and that becomes a police contact. She has multiple episodes in police custody because nobody else will take her. There's nowhere else that police can take her. She has multiple juvenile justice episodes, same kind of thing. She has multiple admissions under the Mental Health Act, but these are generally about her being strapped to a table, sedated for 24 hours and then released. Often when you look through the police records, what psychiatric registrars and others are saying is that, oh no, we're not taking this, she's just attention seeking. And of course, she is attention seeking. If I was her, I would be attention seeking too. But her options for seeking attention are constructed and criminalised, and that's a key problem for this group. Casey's the $5 million woman. So she's had multiple institutional costs. So by the time she is, I think these are up to when she's about 22, she's cost the system over $5.5 million. I gave a version of this to another conference, and I don't know whether people are aware of the organisation WIPAN, Women in Prison, and Kat Armstrong was sitting in the audience and she just looked at me and shook her head and said, gee, I bet she doesn't feel like it. She's the sort of $5 million girl, and she's her complex trajectory and complex enmeshment is actually really, I don't think there's any evidence that there's any way of that she's going on a positive trajectory at this stage. One of the things also just to say about the group is their offence types. So these are not people who are committing serious offences. I've tried to sort of do this with different colours, but basically theft and road traffic offences and regulatory offences are by far the most common. So those in blue, road traffic offences, driving without a licence, driving registration offences, motor vehicle. So these are people who actually have never actually managed to get a driver's licence in most cases, I would think, but are often in places where there are poor public transport, who get in the car and drive. And so it's these very low-level kind of offences that are often getting people caught up in the criminal justice system. Those in green, justice offences are also very common. So these are breaching bail, don't go within 450 metres of the CBD. So if you've got a cognitive impairment, I'm not sure how you're meant to work out where the CBD is and how far 450 metres is, but we're constantly seeing this almost re-inscribing and re-enmeshing for people who have these ridiculous kind of bail conditions that are impossible to meet. I'm just going to skip over these ones because I think we're about fatigue. But what these graphs, I'm just going to show you 4 in a row, they are all showing that actually what happens for this group is that they have contact with police and courts over the whole of their lifespan. So for people who don't have disabilities, you would generally see this trajectory go like that, where you might start to be in contact with the police, from around about 18 or whatever the average age is, 20, and then it would drop off. Whereas in this example, we see that this group of people are not moving out of the criminal justice system. They're consistently over their lives coming into contact. Same with the borderline group, same with the ID-only group, and same with the borderline-only group. So this is a group that once they're enmeshed, they are enmeshed for life. Custodial episodes, so those with complex needs. So again, blue here is the average number of episodes. So the average number of episodes is much higher for this complex group, and the rate per year is also higher. So they're the churners, which everybody in this room would understand and would know well. Also in terms of length of stay, again, short stays, fewer number of days in custody, but rates per year are high. So they're moving in and out all the time. Okay. So just to pull together the gendered picture here, women with complex needs have significantly higher rates of everything. They have shorter custody, shorter duration. They have very low disability service usage. So there's definitely something gendered going on here that's important to take account of. For Indigenous people, same thing. Higher people in the cohort, very high incidence of some form of disability, very, very high incidence of complex disability there, and higher number of convictions. So what does all this mean? What this means is that we have to think about disability in the criminal justice system in a different way. So what we see is that these are highly disadvantaged places that people exist in, that they start out early in life, and we see this funneling. And what we can see for this group is that they're almost never fully in the prison because they're on remand or they're on short sentences, but they're also never fully in the community. They're often homeless and they're moving between these things. So when we think about where we might intervene with that group, they're actually never really fully in the prison and they're never really fully in the community. So we have to start thinking about where they are. We've termed this a marginalised community criminal justice space. They're not falling through the cracks. Rather, as young people, they're given a ticket on the conveyor belt straight into the criminal justice system. So what we're seeing here is something that's systematic and patterned. It's not just, when we go to select some of those case studies that I showed you, we thought, oh boy, that's pretty a bad one. We better see. The story is just the same over and over again. Those are not extreme cases necessarily that I've shared with you today. And what we really want to be able to think through is the lack of appropriate support services and the way that the control agencies themselves come into the fore for this group early on actually compound their disability. So we see mental health disorders emerging for people who have had an awful time. So in fact what we're arguing is that not only are these people vulnerable, but the system itself is creating their complex needs. And I'll just give that one. So what we know is that socioeconomic issues like poverty, disadvantage, lack of positive schooling, discrimination and geography are really important for this group. They have particular individual characteristics. They have a lack of family capacity and they have intergenerational aspects of disadvantage also. There's a lack of appropriate identification, assessment and support of the needs of this group. And we see this negative synergistic interactions. So I had to get a little kind of tricky word in there, which are actually creating complex needs. So we're seeing that people with complex needs, their pathways are multifactorial and multi-staged. And that's really telling us something about how we think about what do we do. We know that there's a complex set of vulnerabilities across individual, social and institutional domains, and these things all work together to bring people with complex needs into contact. Many risk factors we know, and we can identify them from a very young age. Pathways are multi-system and multi-staged. And this is the thing that becomes the problem. For a structured, siloed service system, this complex interaction is very difficult to apprehend. Services actually often only look at the problem that they're tasked with treating you for. And in fact, what often happens for this group is that they're very much too difficult for most of those kind of services, so they get shuffled around between all. But and part of that is then precipitating their further contact with the system. So what do we do? If I had a blueprint for that, I'd... let me just... Okay. Here's what we suggest, some things to think about. Comprehensive support means addressing models and practices in individual and family support. So it's not just about your one thing, but actually about service system cohesion and overarching policy direction. In fact, we don't even talk about this group in a way that everybody understands who they are. There's not even a common language. What has to happen is the sort of services need to be premised on support and not criminalisation, which is what our data shows is happening. Responses, in fact, have to actually identify complex need or complex support need as pervasive and interlocking, and that it therefore can't be nothing in a person's life can be addressed in isolation from any others. There's a whole range of issues around how that's identified by service providers, although I'm sure that every service provider in this room would know exactly what we're talking about. There's no way of identifying that within a service system. We need to have common criteria for identifying people, common language for talking about them, and we need some sort of, back to Patrick's national and uniform approach, a specific cross-portfolio integration which is collaborative, which coordinates services, and it's around things from the very early, from education to child protection to disability and criminal justice. And that, that kind of, I know we talk about service integration, but it's not just a complex problem for individuals, it's a complex policy problem, and we have to look for complex solutions. Okay, and there's some references to materials there as well. That's it from me. Thanks for, for hanging in.
Leanne, you're going to get off that lightly. Questions?
I've probably taken up too much time for questions.
More of a comment, really. I just want to congratulate you on what an extraordinary piece of research. I mean, it really is the work that you and Eileen and your colleagues have been doing in the last few years is utterly pathbreaking. And it'd be wonderful to see it replicated in a national system or across all state territory jurisdictions. So I wish you the best in your research and more power to you.
Thanks. We thought that it would take us 6 months to pull the data set together, and it took us 7 years. Sure.
Can you comment at all on the relationship between what you're finding here and potential implications for people under the NDIA or not?
Yeah, I mean, we've all got our heads thinking in that space, of course. I mean, look, there are a whole range of issues around NDIS and how, these people already are not identified as having a disability. My one little ray of light might be that whilst people are incarcerated and they are identified, then there's the possibility that under the scheme they might be able to apply to become a participant whilst in prison, and therefore there might be a package available to help them transition out. And that's one of the key things that happens, is there's really no proper transition or through care for this group. So that might be a little bit of a ray of light. But part of the big issue here is many of these people won't go near another scheme. I mean, they've had their kids taken away. Every time they've come upon a service, it's been a negative experience. So they may be very unlikely to even be able to be talked into applying to see if they're eligible. So I think engagement between this group and the NDIS is going to be a massive challenge.
I was interested in the case studies, seem to all have victimisation in their past. Were there figures around victimisation?
Yeah, I have done some other, in fact, I'm not sure if it's there. I've only just had it, I've just finished a project for New South Wales Attorney General's Victim Support Fund looking at the victimisation experiences. I don't think it's there, but one of the major thing that it showed is that the association between the more complex your diagnosis, the more likely you are to be the victim of violent crime. So I think of the 2,731 people, 2,660 something had been the victim of crime. So victimisation goes hand in hand for this group. The complexity about victimisation and offending is also this problem of once you become offender, your victimisation is almost never recognised. And also the other issue is for women particularly, you call the police if you're being victimised, and when they arrive they check your name and you've got a warrant. So actually seeking assistance for your victimisation usually re-enmeshes you if you're already an offender. So there's very complex issues around how you identify victimisation. Part of the problem is that victimisation just becomes normalised in the lives of this group. So they are, usually many of them from a very young age are in domestic, family violence is just part of their lives. So they themselves often don't identify as being the victims of crime because it's just the way things are.
Thank you, Leanne.
Pleasure.